Well, it might be the final week in the topic, and you may well be feeling tired, perhaps even sick of it all. Hopefully not. Also, I think you might find the cat moving in the background. That will entertain you. Might add a bit of zest to the final lecture, but it is serious because I may well have taken some points from this lecture to put in the final quiz. And likewise, you should be mindful of the readings for the last week of the topic. They may also bob up in the quiz. So briefly, I want to look at some electoral history, just a sweeping look at history surrounding elections since Federation, and then the election result 2016, the national election. So there's a great little graphic. When I add the second part, you'll realise it took a while to put together, about a day. But I like it, my graphic, that highlights in colour coding the various complexions of government, and in this first half, up until the 1940s. Look, I'm not going to unpack that, and that's there for the record. You've got it in the slides as well, but you might want to pause the lecture and just look at the sweep of electoral history before World War II. But to fill the picture out, and of course it's a very clear picture since really the late 1940s, the domination of national politics by the coalition parties. Significant period in the middle there of the Hawke-Keating years, but otherwise longer periods of coalition government. Of course, open question as to just where we might be travelling with the Turnbull Prime Ministership, whether that will be a shorter period of coalition government. And of course, I'm just noting that should be updated there, 1949 to 2016. Sorry about that. I just want to look at one aspect of electoral history since World War II, and that's the conditions that underpinned a change of government election. Is there anything we can find as a common thread? Well, there is, but only just. So let's look at change of government elections. And by the way, of course, that graph is highlighting to you the proportional seat majority, and the prize lies with the incoming Fraser government in 75. In fact, you might note it's been Liberal governments, when they've come into office, have tended more than Labor governments to win larger majorities. But let's look at the change of government elections. There's only been 5 since World War II. Oh, sorry, look, there's been another. It's not in that graph. That's the Menzies coming in 49. So it's been 6 since World War II. So the Fraser government, what explains it coming in? Well, recession, that dogged Whitlam government, plus the government itself, if you like, falling apart at the seams. There were a number of sackings of ministers by Gough Whitlam. The next one to look at, I think, because it shares some common ground with the incoming Fraser government, and this is the incoming Hawke government, and again, recession is a thing. The government goes to the polls when the economy is recessed. But note as well, the Fraser government had become disunited. There was the emergence of the Peacock group, so-called Wets, challenging Fraser. But significantly as well, opposition leader Bob Hawke came in very late, virtually on the day the election was called, but he was a very well-known Australian, as I'm sure you're aware, having led the Australian trade union movement during the 1970s. Howard government, when it defeated Keating in 1996, you could argue it was a delayed reaction to the recession of the early 90s, plus the Liberals have woken up to the fact that they took a far too radical set of policies to the 93 election. Keating was also not particularly liked, and he was seen as out of touch with, I guess, middle Australia, particularly outer urban swinging seats, marginal seats. Now, Rudd was interesting, nothing to do with recession, this is the boom times, but the government had become unpopular, particularly over its mistake using its power of having a majority in the Senate, and this was around work choices that became the centrepiece of the Labor campaign, but I think it's important to note Rudd really appealed. Remember, this is a Rudd that was unknown for all his foibles to Australians, and he played what you might call the mini-me Howard. I'm another version of Howard, a bit more progressive, and I'm new on the scene. So mini-me Howard is a good scene there. And Abbott, well, look, I think the maxim is governments lose elections rather than oppositions winning. Clearly, as you're well aware, the Labor government lacked unity and there was plenty of infighting. You've seen this graph before, but a reminder at the end of the topic, of course, much is made of that decline and just whether it's going to continue. I'm always very mindful, let's get the mouse here, of what I had said in that period after the dip at the 98 election. Are we entering a significant shift in the party's system? Will a new party emerge which can genuinely challenge the major parties? Was the theme of lectures. Would that continue down? Well, of course it didn't. But we have a steady decline here. I think at the moment the expectation is it's going to continue, but I'm just mindful of being careful with predictions. And then, of course, the Senate. That's a very solid trend. And it's hard to see that being reversed. I mean, you could perhaps say that we've reached the peak of minor parties. How many more could we find that are popular? Well, as I've said in earlier lectures, I fancy that could lie with Poli2019. Yes, and I do note the cat is on the move back behind me. I hope you're still listening to the lecture. I really like this graph because it highlights something about the way voters vote, and it points to a degree of volatility. That is, more and more Australians are going for minor parties in their lower house vote, but of course their preferences ultimately determine which major party wins. But this graph is tracking the gradual increase in seats where a candidate does not win 50% plus one on primary vote. By the way, the red line is simply referring to the fact that the size of the House of Representatives has changed over time, so it's a percentage of all the House of Rep seats. Right, well, there's, I think, a great set of pictures I found for you. I'm delighted in finding this group because who's happy and who's unhappy? It pretty much tells the story. If you looked at this without knowing who'd won the election, you'd say Labor were victorious, wouldn't you? With the rather grumpy face of the Prime Minister facing the people in that terrible speech he gave on election night. Of course, the Greens are happy as they always were, but as we'll see in a moment, there wasn't cause for a load of joy. The vote didn't really go up a great deal. Perhaps it's the joy on Hanson's face and the surprise with the degree of support Australians offered Poli2019's senators around the country. Suggests her smile perhaps reflects something of the mood of the electorate, obviously, but also where her little experiment, her redux, her return, might be travelling. So I just want to quickly take you through some points about the election. There was considerable redrawing of boundaries due to population change. So taking into account the redistributions and the retirement of Palmer, the estimate of seats going into the election, so you give the Palmer seat to the coalition straight away, is that the coalition must not lose more than 14, and that's the key figure. So for a majority of 76, coalition cannot afford to lose more than 14, and of course that's exactly what happened. The coalition lost 14, but ended up being able to govern with that 1 seat majority. And you might note the room is now quiet, the cat's been put out. So here's the table highlighting the House of Reps vote. I just point to Hanson and One Nation. These votes here are much lower than they were in the Senate. And a long way behind, if we look at the Greens here, with over 1 million. But importantly, it's also worth noting that Labor's primary vote, while it did very well at winning seats in the election, is historically very low. That will need to go up. You'd have to argue another 2 or 3% for Labor to feel confident to win the next election. The Liberals result with a 3 1/3% decline. Perhaps you could say had an adverse impact greater than you might have expected due to the lack of preference support for minor parties. and that explained the loss of 14 seats. So looking quickly at the Senate, of course these were the various parties and individuals with Jackie Lambie. You can't really, I guess, see necessarily Hanson as an individual, in as much as she does call it the One Nation Party, but the focus is obviously very much on her. Leyonhjelm was leader of the Liberal Democrats, and then the emergence of Darren Hinch. And of course, now looking at Family First and the problems Bob Day has, you could say he's lucky the news of his company's collapse didn't occur earlier in the year. But look, here's the situation going into the election, and I've just put there a sense of the theory of where they lined up at the end of the 2013 count, centre right, centre left and the centre. But the real issue is where we're at now when we look at the vote. Of course, the thing to note is the much larger vote for both Hanson and Xenophon in the Senate. But also the fact that the Greens did not go up, as they have steadily moved upwards during the last decade and a half. That result perhaps suggests the smiles in that earlier picture perhaps could have been a little less determined, because it's a reasonably poor result for the Greens, and of course they lost my former student, Senator Rob Sims in South Australia. Sorry, they had one down the bottom, just to note the collapse of Palm United's vote. That's a reflection, of course, of also in the House of Reps. So here's the new Senate, and the key point to recognise here is that the Coalition needs 9 crossbenchers to pass legislation whenever Labor and the Greens vote as a bloc. And arguably this is really where the Australian Senate's going to sit for a very long time. It's impossible at this juncture to see the Coalition or Labor manage to get a majority in the Senate. Having said that, it's been said before, wasn't quite seen the fact that John Howard, the Coalition, took control of the Senate between 2004 and 7, given the long years of the balance of power being held by the Australian Democrats. But it's not one party today, of course, that holds the balance of power. It's a plethora of minor parties and individuals. Just quickly, how did voters react to the new Senate electoral system? It's quite interesting. This is from Anthony Green's wonderful analysis subsequent to the count. About 81% of Senate ballot papers had 6 preferences above the line, and 6.6% had fewer than 6 above the line preferences. Anyway, I won't go into that in detail, but it's interesting to note that the above the line 6 preferences, that's a lot less than what it used to be in the mid-90% range for above the line. So increasing numbers of Australians recognise it was worth going to below the line because you didn't have to fill out every box. So finally, let's look at South Australia. The first thing to note is obviously for most of the years, for most of the election outcomes, the dominance of the red and the blue, of Liberal and Labor, and that off yellow, the Australian Democrats. But from 2008, it really begins to change. We see the presence of Green senators, we see the presence of Family First, and of course Xenophon. But what I've put in for the recent election is the order of election of the senators in the double dissolution. So the first 6 there get the double term, and then we have the second 6 who will be up for election at the next election. I guess the standout is obviously Xenophon, but the fact that the Xenophon team, 3 of them were elected ahead of the Green Sarah Hanson-Young. And the question has to arise at the next election whether the Greens are under something of a threat from the Xenophon team, or for that matter, of course, Labor seeking a second senator. The issue really here is that Senate races now, the contest for the Senate, is now part of the campaign, at least in South Australia. For most of our electoral history, the whole focus has been on the reps, of course, the campaign for the reps. Well, not anymore in this state. So it is a hot contest in South Australia, the election for the Senate, and I think it adds a real spice to our election campaigns. So I hope that gives you something of an overview of the 2016 election against the background of some history. And bear in mind, there may be a question or two in the quiz from this lecture.